So I have the pleasure to welcome and to introduce to you Professor Jordi Jaumandreu. Probably I don't have to introduce a lot. Jordi was professor at Carlos III, and now for a number of years, 8 or 10 years, he is at Boston University. He has done a lot of work on the economics of innovation, productivity, industrial organization, and I like particularly his approach to economic research. He defines an issue and then he thinks about this issue. He collects data, or he uses the data he can find to answer that problem. Then he has the econometric techniques, and he uses very advanced econometric techniques. But then there is something else that most people do not do, and he uses theory. And from theory, he tries to let the data speak, using the data and then analyzing the data and using the right techniques. And then he's looking at, do these coefficients make sense? Could I have some kind of endogeneity problem? What would be the bias? And then if he doesn't find it, then he thinks about it. Is there something wrong in it? So it's a very nice, robust analysis. And so I'm very happy that you accepted to come and give us this presentation. So he's going to give a presentation on separating productivity from demand heterogeneity.
Thank you very much, Pierre, for this very kind introduction. I really would like that this is my method. I try. And, well, I am really happy to have the opportunity to explain my thoughts about this question here in this conference. I hope you will be interested. I'm sorry for the state of my voice. Here is summer, but in Boston the other day we were at -10 Celsius. And then this day I got a cold. I had to teach, and then I forced a little my voice and has gone down. I suppose with the help of this microphone you can follow me, and let's try. So the main idea of this reflection that I'm going to do is that firms, in fact, they make different types of investment. One is the physical investment in capital to carry out production. Another is technological investment to try cost reductions. And the other is investment to try demand expansion. And this question of separating the efforts of firms in trying to get cost reductions and demand enhancement or demand reinforcement seems to be quite accepted, because even statistical authorities try to distinguish what is process innovation from what is product innovation, that in fact reflects that that's a reality, in fact. Firms try to do both things. There is an important paper a few years ago by Foster, Altiwangel, Syverson that summarized the effects of these two types of efforts very well. They say how firms grow. Firms grow at least in two ways. One way is in imperfect competition you have a demand that is downward sloping, and you can try to put a price that is lower than the price of your competitors. And how you do that? Well, with cost reduction you can then try a movement along this demand, that is your demand given the situation in the market. But there is another possibility, and the other possibility is you try really to expand your demand, to move the demand forward, that for each price people want more your product. This is what we are going to call demand enhancement, and is the other way to expand, or the other way in which firms can grow. I will put in a moment a couple of examples. In this talk I am going to do three things. The first, I am going to discuss what is the framework, the most theoretical framework to to discuss these two types of growth. Then I am going to summarize the facts that we have found with my Chinese co-author Hen Jin for a big sample of Chinese firms. This has motivated many of the reflections that I am going to explain to you, and I think it's interesting to take a look at the data. And then finally, I'm going to develop two implications of what I am saying in this talk. Two implications that are things that I am currently working on. I will be very happy to share these thoughts with you and to receive any feedback from you, because these are things in which I'm trying to work right now. Let's put two practical examples to be clear about what we are speaking. In our sample, we have two big firms, for example. One is Conca, that is a TV and electronics producer. And you know that during the first part of the 2000s, the growth in China was really amazing. So this is not special cases. All the companies grow in this way. Conca, that is a firm that more or less is mainly a domestic seller, but exported 20% in 2008 of its production, has almost doubled the production from 2001 to 2008, and keeping exactly the same employment, 17,000 people. This implies, even measured just by productivity, labor productivity, this implies an increase in productivity and a decrease in cost. And this is very clear when you see at the prices. The standard TV set of 21 inches is divided by 3 in these 8 years. So the sales expansion of this firm, we may think that basically is a sales expansion of the first type. The firm is moving along a demand, that is a demand downward sloping, and reduces the price and gets, if the competitors don't reduce at the same pace, gets more sales. But you have another firm that is a producer of instant noodles. Here there is no Chinese people, but if you speak in Boston, half of the audience is Chinese, and they know perfectly this Master Kong brand, because it's very famous. Even outside of China, that people consume these instant noodles. No? And expand sales from 98 to 2008 in 11 years, multiplying by a factor of 7. And doubles employment. Employment at the end of the period is 50,000 people. And in this case, the price, or the unit price of these instant noodles almost doubles, goes from 1.5 to 2.8. How the firm grows? Grows because it's improving distribution. And mainly was the change of one way of distributing that was based on external wholesalers to have their own distribution, and then improving the quality of the product in the sense that the product was much more available at any retail. In a product of this type, this is an increase in quality. This provoked this enormous expansion in sales. Just to put two examples of what we are talking about. So first, I'm going to go over an abstract model of investment of firms. Then I will stop talking a little why I think that separating productivity from demand heterogeneity is important. Then I will focus in the results of the paper on China. We have 11 years of data and we work with data on 70,000 companies that are at the same time sellers in the domestic market and in the export market. And then I will go briefly, because I have no time, presumably, about two implications of what we are saying. I'm going to be very critical with some current estimates of markups that are very popular and have been published in many good journals, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I am going to insist in the need for looking for models that are more robust to product differentiation that are our current models. These are the two implications that I'm going to talk about. Wow. Okay. A model for investment of the firm. Let's suppose a firm that has a dynamic maximization problem, so maximizes the expected net value of cash flows. And let's suppose that this firm needs to do three types of investments. One is the investment in capital. Capital has the classical law of motion, in which capital at moment T is the result of depreciated capital in the previous period plus investment. But let's suppose that at the same time, this firm, the production function that I write in a general way, because nothing here depends, in fact, of the functional form, is a production function that is affected by efficiency in Higgs neutral way. We could generalize that, but we are going to work in this talk with Higgs neutral efficiency, and then this omega represents the level of productivity that is persistent but evolves over time, and the firm is going to do investments that are going to affect this omega, and affecting this omega is able to produce more with the same inputs and to decrease cost. But at the same time, we are going to add the other element that is in a demand relationship in which the quantity that you are selling depends on the price, negatively, of course, but here I'm general. And seed represents intercepts of this demand, but intercepts that are observable. Your sales depend on your location, of your number of outlets, on the advertising and promotion that you are. All this is in seed. But in addition to that, you see that when you compare two firms that they have exactly the same seeds and the same price, even in this case, one firm is selling more than the other. And then what remains to be explained is what we put in this delta. This is a delta that collapses all the other reasons for selling more. Maybe technology, maybe design, maybe treatment of the clients, maybe that you have been for a longer time in the market and you have accumulated some relationship, the long term with some of the clients. You can put here many things. Delta plays exactly the same role that in the production function plays the omega. But there are different things, because omega explains how you produce more than other firms with the same inputs, and delta explains how you sell more with the same price and with the same observed actions. The first paper that I have said before, the first paper that insisted in that was this paper by Foster, Altiwanger, and Syverson. And before that, there were some papers. Marcella was in one of these papers. Let's suppose that in the evolution of omega and the evolution of delta depend on the investments of the firms, and let's talk in general investment in 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 cost reduction as IC, and investment in demand enhancement as ID. The important thing is that you can try to model that, and then this gives or raises a dynamic model in which the firm is investing in the three things at the same time. This is the type of model in which we want to think of. And this implies that omega and delta are or can be modeled as Markov processes, but are Markov processes that are not of the exogenous type. They don't evolve only by themselves. They evolve shifting according with the investments of the firms. If you construct a model of this way, you should think also how is produced the shutdown of the firms. And the natural thing is, according to this dynamic problem, is suppose that the firms go away from the market when the combination of cost advantages and demand advantages is so low that the profits are not enough to stay in the market. And in this sense, when this combination goes below a threshold, that is a threshold that you should to estimate ideally, then is when the firm shuts down. If you have output prices, all these things that I have told you, in fact, you can linearize both relationships, the demand relationship, the production function relationship, and you can try to estimate the system. In fact, we did this with Jack, and we have an MBR working paper in 2010 in which we have a preliminary estimate of that, in which omega and delta, we suppose that depend on a series of investments of firms, and it worked quite well. We still continue working with this model. No? In some sense, what I am going to explain today, it goes to a little more basic things. But one of the possibilities of this kind of work is to continue, if you have prices, trying to estimate this kind of system and separate by means of this kind of system, separate omega from delta. The problem is that it's very strange to have output prices. In particular, in Latin America, there are output prices in Colombia, and I think you can do something with a database in Chile, but not many more places. Sometimes you have input prices, but output prices is a strange thing. And people know that, has been knowing that from a long time. In fact, it was a famous article by Klete and Gilkes in '96 that they were discussing what is the problem of not having specific output prices. And then they advanced a solution that has been worked later by different people. For example, De Loecker in 2011 in Econometrica is a paper that basically applies Klete and Gilkes, but applies Klete and Gilkes using the Olean package way to model productivity. But there is nothing new with respect to these two papers. And basically, the idea of Klete and Gilkes was you take the demand, you can invert the demand, so instead of writing quantity as a function of price, you write price as a function of quantity. You multiply then by Q, and then you have revenue instead of P as the dependent variable, and you have Q as the explanatory variable, and this Q, you plug the production function. And then this, in fact, is plugging the production function inside the demand relationship, and then you don't need the price, in principle. Okay. Just you can do also the opposite. You can take the direct demand, in which Q is explained by P, you multiply by P, then you have revenue as a function of P, and then you can replace P by the optimal relationship of P according to a generic imperfect competition model. For example, if you think that the firms are setting the price with a markup of marginal cost, then you write price with a markup of marginal cost. Marginal cost can be split in the part that is observable, that here I summarize with MC bar. MC bar is, if we are in a short run, we suppose that capital is given. If capital is given, it should be here capital. The rest of marginal cost depends on also prices of the inputs, so you have the prices of the inputs. This part is a part that is known in the sense that it's an expression that can be written in terms of known variables, but there is one part of marginal cost that is the effect of productivity that we cannot measure. And the total marginal cost is this MC bar minus omega. Okay, taking this second way, I particularly like by a series of reasons that I have no time to go, but I think this way that was used by O. Roberts and Xu in 2011 in AAR, I think is a good way to deal with the problem. Then you can take the demand function in terms of revenue, you replace the price, and you get an expression like that. Whatever is the way that you follow, you have exactly the same problem, and it's the problem that you have summarized in the expression that there is here. You are going to get a relationship that is in terms of revenue, yes, so you don't need to have prices, you don't need to have quantity, but in your explanatory part, you have a combination of the two unobservables, the productivity unobservable and let's call delta demand heterogeneity unobservable. So you have productivity and you have demand heterogeneity. And is weighted by the elasticity of demand. So the form of that takes in both cases is eta minus 1 times omega plus delta. People have been recognizing that. Even if you read the papers, sometimes you don't notice. But people have been recognizing that and have been recognizing, in fact, that delta can be very important. The first papers, Clayton and Gilkes, they solved the problems that this creates just by supposing that delta was white noise, something uncorrelated, and in this case, this doesn't create any problem. But if you think that delta is really something that is correlated over time, that's a serious problem. And examples of papers that recognize that are C and Clino, that is a very popular macro paper. They say, well, we cannot separate productivity from demand heterogeneity. Gandhi, Rivers, and Navarro, both the previous version and the version that they have now, just very recently. This paper is a paper on production function that maybe will be published soon. But in this respect of, they have no solution for that, and they recognize that. The main part of the paper is just saying, no, we are in a market with perfect competition and perfectly homogeneous product. If we are in perfect competition and perfectly homogeneous product, this problem doesn't exist, because the delta is a question. Well, it doesn't exist. Maybe I am exaggerated that. Also can exist in perfect competition, but it's not as important. Probably when it's really important is when you have product differentiation. So, Asker, Kohler, and Delwecker, Boller, Moxnes, and Hulett-Moy, these are all good papers published in top journals. No? Peters, Roberts, and Banana and Fridge is a very recent paper, or a paper that is still not published, but it's a very nice paper about the role of R&D in US multinationals by Biller and Morales. All these papers, then they say, well, we cannot separate, let's deal with the composite of both things. What's the problem of dealing with the composite? Why we want to separate? I'm going to give you some reasons. First, it seems that it's nice if you can describe separately. It's not the same if a firm is growing because more productivity, or a firm is growing by more demand. And the paths that both types of growth can have are very different, and the dispersion, and it seems that this is part of the analysis. But this, in addition, probably is a very policy-relevant question, because in one case you are trying to reduce cost, in the other case you are doing something very different. You are trying to enhance design, product characteristics, and things like that. In fact, what we find in China is that there is a trade-off. If you push the characteristics of the goods, you want to produce with more quality, with more technology, the inputs that you use are more expensive, and you need to pay for that. So, in fact, you are not going to be as efficient as you would like in cost. There is the typical trade-off. Then this means that from the policy point of view, that's a very relevant thing, because we should be able, in a given moment, in a given country, especially in developing countries, to say you should focus more in being efficient, being cheaper, or you should focus more in developing more technology, because you are doing badly in the international markets because maybe you don't develop quality enough. In fact, Chinese, for example, they are completely conscious of that. If you read something that now, with motive of the Congress, has been, again, one leitmotif, they have a plan that they call Made in China 2025. That seems a plan written for one of us, or one person in IO, that says we should develop products that are better designed, with more technical quality, with a cleaner production, because this is the only way in which we will be able to keep our place in the markets. Another thing is how they are going to do that. That's never clear with Chinese. Chinese can, the bureaucrats can perfectly say what should be done, but it's not clear how they are going to reach these goals, because they have the political and economic system, the ways to do that is very make very difficult to implement. But the diagnosis, it seems, is clear. Even this question that is fashion, that is the analysis of allocation, if you do the analysis of allocation only thinking in cost, that's really wrong, because what you want is not minimize the cost of your products. Minimize the cost of your products is not objective that maximizes social welfare. If you want to maximize social welfare, you need a right combination of low cost and enough quality and design. And in addition, there are two methodological issues that I would like to stress. One is, if you have an unobservable in the demand, that is an unobservable delta that is related, as we say, to the quality of the products and the prices of the inputs, then you cannot use as instruments, as many papers do, productivity as for instrument in price, because this productivity is just correlated with unobservable. Productivity is not a legitimate instrument. And the prices of the inputs, the same, because firms with more quality, they are going to have a higher price that they pay for the inputs, and it's going to be correlated with the unobservable. There is another methodological issue that relates not demand, relates to production function. That is, I'm going to show you later in the implications that in fact, if you are working with a sample of imperfectly competitive firms, you need to explicitly deal with the heterogeneity of demand. If you don't deal with heterogeneity of demand, you are not consistent. That's theoretically a very clear conclusion. Okay, let me talk a little about what we do in the China paper. In the China paper, to try to identify both unobservables without prices, because we don't have output prices, what we do is a trick of separating the activity of the firms in two markets, the market for exports and the domestic market. So we take only firms that sell at the same time in both markets. Our sample is big. We have 70,000 firms that do that. And then you have two relationships of the type of relationship that I have explained you later. We have an external demand, a domestic demand. We suppose that the product that these firms selling is the same in both markets, so you arrive to two equations of the type of the equation that I have told you before. Then if you have two equations for two unobservables, the good thing is that you can invert these equations to solve in terms of the two unobservables. And this is what we do. We assume that the unobservables follow a Markov process. In this first exercise, it was complicated enough by itself. We didn't try to make the heterogeneity. So we are working with simple exogenous Markov processes. But the next step should be to introduce in these two Markov processes, introduce the determinants. This is still pending. But if you suppose that and you take the system above at moment -1 and you invert, then you can write two relationships that are completely relationships in terms of observables. Complicated relationships, but in terms of observables. So you have two semi-parametric equations with cross restrictions that you can estimate applying nonlinear GMM. So how is identification here? Well, you use two very strong assumptions. The first strong assumption is you are assuming that the firm sells the same product in the export market and the domestic market. The same firm has only one product or one set of products. This is strong. In my opinion, not so strong. And there is no evidence that it's not true. People insist a lot that firms are selling different products in different places, but it's not clear that if you have a sale of products, you are selling a different set in the exterior market and in the domestic market. There is no evidence. One of the reasons by which there is no evidence about that is because there is no data. When there are detailed data about products, are customs data. And custom data have a lot of detail about what you sell, what do you sell in America and what you sell in Europe and what you sell in Asia, but no data about what you sell domestically, so it's not clear. This first assumption is strong, but can be relaxed. If you are lucky enough to have some data that allows you to write the marginal cost depending of factors that are affecting differently to what you sell outside and inside, you can generalize that. We don't have this data. but it's possible. In our paper, we developed a model in which you can do that. The other strong assumption is you are supposing that the demand heterogeneity has the same impact in both markets, because you need to have the same delta in both equations to invert. Well, we do some robustness check. Delta is an unobservable, but this doesn't mean that you cannot put a coefficient. So in a given moment in the paper, we develop a robustness check in which in one equation, that is the domestic equation, we write lambda delta, and in the other equation, delta. And we estimate lambda. In half of the industries, lambda is 1. In the other half, no. So there is room for this criticism. I recognize that. The problem is, for identifying things, you always need to compromise something. The problem is if you are doing the right compromises or not. We apply a new method to identify the elasticities. You can guess that with this kind of equations, it's going to be very difficult to separate the elasticity of demand in the exterior market, in the domestic market, from the coefficients of the marginal cost that are also the coefficients of the production function. And then we use a third equation. This third equation is a very classical equation. It's the equation of margins. What you see if you divide the revenue of the firm by a variable cost of the firm, you see something that is the price average cost margin. And then what we say is price average cost margin, we recognize that this is a function of two things. It's a function of the elasticity of demand, and it's also a function of the short-run scale that we call mu. That is, if you suppose that in the short run the firm what takes into account is the possibility to change labor and materials, then this mu would be beta L plus beta M. You cannot separate these two things. This is the reason by which the price average cost in the past was very used, but was subject to criticism and people stopped using. But modern techniques allow you to do something that we do. That is, in this third equation, we estimate a functional that is a functional of these two things, of nu and the elasticity of demand. And then what we carry to the system of equations is just this functional. So we impose what we have got in the other equation as a restriction of the system. And then we estimate everything at the same time. Because no one of the subsets of the system gives identification by itself, but both together they give identification. Econometrically is a little complicated, but sounds a little complicated, is not in practice. Okay, results. More or less I have 10 minutes. Okay, I'm going to go fast over the results. We first get a joint distribution of productivity and demand heterogeneity that I'm going to comment in a moment. We get, and this is key, that there is a negative correlation between omega and delta. When I describe the results, I am going always to talk of delta standardized by the elasticity of demand in the domestic market -1. And the reason is omega is an unobservable that affects price. And delta is an unobservable that affects quantity. So they have different scale. If you want to compare the levels, you need to rescale one of the two. Divide delta or multiply omega. And you may use the elasticity that you want. This doesn't change basically the things, but that's the reason for this scaling. Then I'm going to talk about the growth of the advantages. Familiarly, we talk of cost advantages and demand advantages to refer to omega and delta. The decomposition of these advantages, and 3 illustrations in which we say, okay, let's demonstrate that really is useful to have these 2 unobservables. Very quickly, look at the mean. It's not, we divide our sample in 10 industries. Jack knows that I want to do this always. I don't want to estimate never an equation for the whole sample because of the heterogeneity of the coefficients. But here, just to summarize the things, we do a mean of the estimates. And then what you have in the last row is the mean. Here you have the quartiles. What do you see? Well, you see omega and the scale delta can be given an interpretation in percentage points. You see that the difference between the first quartile and the third quartile is approximately 50% in the case of omega, and is approximately 60% in the case of scale delta. What this means? Well, this means that for the firms in the same industry, for the 50% central firms of the distribution, you are going to see that the prices, for reason of different cost, can diverge by 50%. Okay? Or, the interquartile range is 50%. You see, the willingness to pay on the consumers for the reasons of the difference in delta are even a little more extended. It's 60%. So you can find that implicitly in the demand is such that for these 50% of the firms that are in the center of the distribution, consumers even, they want to pay 60% more than pay to the other firm just because of the different quality. So, in fact, this is telling you that delta is a little more dispersed, is at least as important as omega, and a little more dispersed. These are what in mathematics is called the level sets. You can imagine the joint distribution of omega and delta as a sort of, you may think intuitively as a normal distribution. They are not normal distribution because we are not imposing normality. These are empirical distributions. And if you cut at different levels, you get the level sets. And the level sets are nice because they are indicating very clearly that there is a negative correlation between the 2 types of advantages. Here, to see how the distribution has moved over time, we have in green the level sets corresponding to the distribution at the beginning of the period, and in black, the level sets corresponding at the end of the period. How are the correlations? Look again at the mean. The correlation between omega and delta is strongly negative, minus 0.4, strongly negative. And what happens, what do you see if you correlate omega with the observed part of marginal cost? The observed part of marginal cost has the price of labor, the price of materials. What happens? Even a strong positive correlation. That means that when you have advantages in cost, many times you are using a superior input in the sense that you pay more to the workers and you pay more for the materials. It's not contradictory to pay more with having superior productivity. What happens when you correlate delta, the demand advantage, with marginal cost, total marginal cost? Is strongly positively correlated. This means simply when you see a firm that is selling much more than another firm at the same price and with the same promotion, you will see that this firm has a higher marginal cost, so has less cost advantages. And both things, they have positive impact on profits. So the picture that emerges from here is both omega and delta are desirable for firms. Firms want to have both things. Both things give profits, but it's not possible to have the best of cost advantages and demand advantages at the same time. There is a trade-off. If you want more quality, you are less productive, and conversely. So, what about the growth? Well, the growth of China during this period in what are cost advantages was impressive. This is the whole increase. In 11 years, the average growth of omega is 40%. But the increase in demand advantages is much less impressive and depends on two sectors. China only developed advantages seriously, demand advantages seriously, in machinery and in electronics, not in the other sectors. In some of them, even it went backward. It's completely logical that they are worried and they are making the plan made in China 25, because they know that this is a very strong weakness of the exports of China. The exports of China have been relying a lot in simply low quality, less price. And they know that they need to change that because India is growing exports and other countries of the south of Asia and so on. Okay, we have checked that this is not because entry, I skipped that. This is the image of what happens with omega and with delta across sectors. Simply, I have no time to go over that. Simply to say, omega is a question of survivors. So omega is a question of the firms that continue staying. The entrants enter with less omega, so are less efficient. But the entrants that are many times private firms enter with more demand advantages. Here is a first analysis in which it makes a lot of difference to distinguish, because people sometimes get surprised saying, oh, the entrants are very good in China. Well, are very good. It happens the same that happens everywhere. In cost, they are not better, but in demand advantages, yes. This has a lot of plausible explanations, because they are private firms that they are taking opportunities of business, and it seems that the firms in the process of privatization, they were not as fast in getting these opportunities. Well, there are three exercises that are interesting. One is just we try to put our omegas and our deltas under the point of view of how privatization has contributed. And when we control for selection, the conclusion that we arrive is that privatization by itself didn't increase any one of the two things. Only a little productivity, but when you control for selection, no. You can go about the details in the paper. A very interesting thing, it has been always a sort of puzzle why the intensity of the exporters in China is like a U. there are some exporters that export only 10% of the sales, and there are other exporters that are exporting 90% of the sales. And in the middle, 50%, there are less. We are able to match a big part of this U-shaped distribution just using our cost and demand advantages. What is the main conclusion of that? The main conclusion of that is that one part of the Chinese firms have specialized in very low quality and high cost efficiency. And there are firms that have now this choice, and they are exporting 90% of the sales. One implication. Deloitte and Barczynski proposed in American Economic Review a way to estimate markups. This is very popular. There is an econometric paper, Leuker, Goldberg, Kandelbal, and Pavnik, saying what happens with markups in India. And there is a very recent paper by Lauren Brand, Van Bissenbroek, Wang and Sang in American Economic Review, the last issue, about productivity in China. Then what these papers say? Well, these papers say that exporters, they have higher margins. And they say that after liberalization, Indian firms, they have higher margins. There are things that are counter what theory says that should be. They are presented as findings. And the effects of the entry in the WTO of China has been also the increase of margins. I have always thought that there is something strange there. What I have in this slide that are available to you is the explanation for why the method that these markups are computed doesn't take into account the heterogeneity of demand. And then when you regress these margins estimated in the way they propose in exports, for example, you expect big biases. And these big biases can tell things as I have told you. I'm not telling you because I have not replicated these works. I have done other exercises, but I can tell you that there is no consistency, so anything can be true. So this question of the heterogeneity of demand is relevant for that. Second, searching for models robust to differentiation. What happens? That happens what, in fact, what I am telling you is outputs are different, inputs are different. So there is an enormous heterogeneity in production functions. How we should deal with that? Well, classically, they have trials to deal with that. In the output case, there are even some recent papers that start. The way to consider that is that the firm has a multi-output. It's not only quantity what is relevant. It's quantity and at least quality, or in general, if you want, quantity and characteristics of this product. So the dependent variable should no longer be only Q. It should be a multi-output production function in which you take into account all these things. This is also evident, by the way, when you want to do green estimation, because one of the things that you want to take into account is quantity and pollution, okay? Multi-output production functions is something that is not as difficult to deal with, and I think we should do. But we have the input side. The input side, Gilkes was the pioneer in that. In 1957, he writes the first paper that says a worker is not the same as another worker, and explains what is the bias when you say number of workers or number of hours. Explains the bias that you have. I have no time to go with detail. If you think of a model with horizontal differentiation and vertical differentiation, here what makes the thing very difficult is that when firms diverge in the market, you should think that they diverge by at least two reasons, because they serve different groups of customers, more or less with the same price, and also by quality. But you cannot say that there is only one dimension. When you take into account these things and you take into account the problem of output and input, you arrive to a production function as you have in the top of this slide. And a production function as you have in the top of this file means that what you are going to get if you use observe things is what is in the bottom. And this thing that you are in the bottom says you are going to get the true productivity, to say in an easy way, true productivity that is omega star, minus the impact of quality in productivity, that is important, and plus the quality of the inputs, for example, more skilled workers. An objective is to try to separate all these things. How can be separated? Well, one of the possibilities of separate is just, again, to use the demand. Because if you are able to specify the demand in a way in which you take into account the impact of quality, then a possibility of identification is relate just the impact that quality has in productivity or has in the production function through the impact that has in demand. The problem is more complicated because we also have horizontal differentiation in which there is no quality. But in principle it's possible, and it's something that I'm working with Henjin with the Chinese data. For China it's very important because more or less 75–80% of the firms are new firms that have entered in the last 10 years. So products are new, and products have been completely renovated, and the qualities of the products are completely different. Okay, well, I skip you to go with detail about the remarks. Basically, what this is saying is we are working in separating productivity from quality and demand heterogeneity. Not taking this into account can make you to be wrong in measuring markups, can make you to be very imprecise in measuring production functions and productivity. And well, when this is addressed, still there are at least two things in which it's important to work, I think, in the immediate future. One is varying demand elasticities. In fact, we have already started with that because we distinguish demand in the export market, demand in the domestic market, and second, the determinants of productivity. These determinants are important because at the end, for policy purposes, what we want to know is how you can affect through productivity and how you can affect through quality. Okay? Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the...